Thanks very much. As people are just streaming back in after the break, I just wanted to remind everyone why we're here today. I mean, certainly, at DriverCheck, we have our why, our purpose, which is really to create a healthier and safer world for all. And we believe that one of the ways that we can do this is by putting good medicine first, and understand that learning and adapting to the changes are key to this purpose. Being here, you also likely embrace the fact that keeping up with changes in occupational health and regulatory compliance and the adoption of best practices is also key. And so you'll understand why our theme this year is empower. Empower yourselves, empower others, empower change, so that you can take some of these great nuggets that we're hearing from our speakers, you can let that marinate over the next couple of days, and then perhaps use it to affect change in your own organizations. So welcome back from the break. I wanted to kick off this last part of the morning here by introducing, you've already heard her, but by introducing Melissa Roth. Melissa is a partner in Gowling WLG's Waterloo Region Office and practices in the Employment, Labor, and Equalities Group. She works with private and public sector employers on a wide range of issues, including human rights, wrongful dismissals, employment contracts and policies, labor law, workplace investigations, and occupational health and safety. Melissa is a frequent speaker with employer groups and professional organizations, and we're so glad that she's able to join us here today. Please help me welcome Melissa Roth to our stage.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited to be here. The presentations today are great, and tomorrow will be just as great. Hopefully, you'll enjoy our presentation today with respect to accommodation. We're going to be discussing obligations regarding accommodation, but also understanding how we can best assist now and accommodate employees as we adjust to the new normal. We have some workplaces that are returning to in-person work. We have other workplaces that are going for the hybrid model. And then we still have the workplaces that are continuing to embrace completely remote work. So with that, it brings some added stresses to employers and human resources professionals with respect to accommodation. Now, the best way to set the scene for our discussion today is to get a grasp of the statistics surrounding mental health and the workplace in Canada. And keep in mind that the stats that you have in there are in the context of remote workers increasing significantly. So in 2016, Statistics Canada said that we had 4% of remote workers. By 2021, that number went up by 28% because we had 32% remote workers. So with that number of employees working remotely and with the effects that the pandemic has had, when we think about accommodation, we have to really set ourselves within the current situation. As you can see in your slides there, in any given year, we have 1 in 5 Canadians that are experiencing mental illness. By the time that Canadians reach 40, 50% have or have had a mental illness. More than 6.7 million Canadians live with mental health issues nowadays, and this is out of we're just shy of 40 million, so this is about 15%. Approximately 21% of Canadians meet the criteria for a substance use disorder, and we know that mental health is a very challenging thing to accommodate and to deal with in the workplace. So 1 in 3 workplace disability claims are related to mental health illnesses, and 70% of disability costs are attributed to mental illness. So that's why, when we're going to talk today, this all applies to physical disabilities and your traditional accommodation approach, but it has to be tailored to the reality that we're in now. The total cost for employers is estimated to be 12 to 19% of payroll cost to deal with disability issues. And for every 1,000 employees, an employer can face up to $380,000 a year in productivity losses in addition to the costs that come due to the disability claims. So the pandemic has only increased the number of instances and the severity of the mental health crisis in Canada. 81% have reported that the pandemic has negatively affected their mental health. And those who provide direct care to COVID-19 patients or those who have been quarantined are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop symptoms of disabilities, post-traumatic stress, than those who are not exposed to those conditions. And think about how many of us have provided care or have had COVID, had to quarantine, right? So, and with this context, we're seeing increased rates of also harassment in the workplace. And these allegations of harassment are coming outside of the traditional model of all of us working together in the same office. We're still seeing them with fully remote workplaces. Now, to finish off with the stats, among those that are employed, the proportion with mental health-related disabilities increased from 6.4% in 2019 to 8.7% in 2021. So again, we're seeing a significant increase. And about 1/4 of Canadians have considered leaving their current job because of their employer's response to the pandemic. And the most reported reason for considering leaving their job is increased mental stress and increased strain at work. That's 53%. So I really want you to keep in mind that context as we go along this issue of accommodation in the new workplace. So with all of those past and current changes that we're still seeing, as we go along, we have to remember that instances of stress, of burnout, of anxiety, of depression, and PTSD have all increased over the course of the pandemic. And working from home has had some positive, but also some negative consequences. So, loneliness, the feelings of loneliness, the feeling of a lack of separation between work and home, excessive hours. And this is something that, while it's not related to accommodation, when you're thinking as an employer about your obligations under the ESA to keep track of people's hours of work, you need to really think about those people who are working remotely and how you are keeping tabs on, not keeping tabs on them for the purpose of making sure that they're working, because I think we've all gotten past that and we know there's ways that we can figure it out, but keeping track of their hours of work, because what we are seeing is that people are working extreme hours in some cases. Without the ability to disconnect. And of course, there's also the risk associated with the physical risk of the home office setup, and how is that home office set up, and how is it going to potentially cause issues from an occupational health and safety or WSIB perspective. So employers have to be mindful not only of these consequences, but also of the consequences of a return to the office. Right? For those of you who are asking people to come back, you have to keep in mind that some people simply find the change stressful. And while garden variety stress is not a disability, if it becomes part of a medical condition, then this is something that we need to think about and we need to accommodate. Some people struggle with respect to the social challenges of working back into the office as opposed to being at home alone for the last 2 years, the challenges that come from hybrid teams. And a lot of people are really experiencing greater awareness of office politics because they weren't used to it for the last couple of years. Some employees might now see an added cost associated with commuting and may find it unnecessary or unacceptable. So, they'll seek accommodation for those types of things, but we have to determine what of this is actually a request for accommodation and what of it is a preference. And even if it is a preference, how do we keep the morale and retain employees? So we're seeing also, obviously, the effect that returning to the office has on the work-life balance, and again, we have to deal with that as well. So ultimately, most employees have increased expectations and sometimes increased needs for flexibility, for flexible working arrangements, and that poses new challenges for employers that are hard to navigate. So add to that obligations under the Human Rights Code, and we get a pretty complicated recipe. Now, before we get started with respect to the specifics of accommodation, since we know that mental health is on the rise, so we need to think about what comes with them, including the challenge that mental health causes for instance, being fit for duty, whether it is substance abuse or substance use disorders related to mental health or unrelated to it, exhaustion, for instance, brought on by symptoms of chronic depression, impaired executive function. All of those things can affect fitness for duty and may require the employer to take on an accommodation approach to certain situations. So we have to think about what we're going to do about it, because ignoring it is really not going to help the situation. So for that is that we encourage employers to be very proactive with respect to mental health programs. And you have to ask yourself, are you doing anything of what's in this slide in your workplace? And do you have the ability to impose some kind of culture change by implementing some of these techniques to deal with mental health, to not ignore the statistics? By destigmatizing mental health and accommodations, the pandemic has really helped to uncouple workplace accommodations from the negative stereotypes that have often been evoked by the concept of a disability. In normalizing accommodations, the pandemic has helped to change the understanding about the need for accommodations from a deficit model to a model that recognizes universal vulnerability. So we can't think of accommodation as a burden. We have to really embrace the situation because we have to deal with it, and that's how we create a better workplace. Employers have described how the pandemic has helped to dispel some of the myths about different types of accommodations, as well as challenging assumptions about the supposed inherent benefits of the traditional work setups regarding how and when and where work has to be performed to ensure a worker's productivity. We know that those myths are not necessarily there. And as we will talk about a little more later, once we've done the remote work, once we've done the hybrid work, our ability to say that we can't continue it, it's going to be slightly hindered by the circumstances of the last 2 years. Many workplaces have now acquired all of the tools or have transferred onto technological platforms that are needed for remote work and to make it possible, to make it efficient. And this provides organizations with infrastructure that they can continue to use in the future to expand the type of accommodations that they offer. Because before, we had a very quick response to a lot of requests for accommodations because we saw the attendance at work as an essential duty or as the most essential part of your employment. So in doing so, we may be able to retain your workforce, retain talent, as we are in a situation where there is a huge shortage for talent and lots of expectations from employees. You may be able to improve efficiency, and you may be able to cut down on costs that arise from paying disability benefits because you're actually engaging with your employee population and allowing them to remain in the workplace. Many organizations, including CAMH, of course, provide training for workplace mental health. So if you go to CAMH, you go to CAMH to, what do we do? And you go to the national programs, they have workplace mental health training. And, places like where I work have several people trained on mental health, which then have a sticker on their door saying, this is a safe place. I am a mental health expert. I am not expert, but I am a mental health ambassador. So we really have to consider changing the outlook that we have with respect to mental health. And with that, I'd like to test our perceptions a little bit. What do we think about when we say health and safety in the workplace? We think about PPE, we think about hard hats, right? But do we think about mental health, right? When we talk about health and safety in the workplace, I dare say a lot of people do not think about mental health. So it's time to think psychological when you think of health and safety issues, because your employees and ultimately your bottom line need you to think that way. After 2 years of pandemic life, employees are struggling with their mental health, and you want to do what's right, not just for your employees, but also for your business ultimately. So you need to have a plan, and you need to have some expert advice, and those are some tips that you can use to think about how you deal with mental health in the workplace. So now that we set the context for our discussion today, the commentary on your slides is from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So we know that we have to accommodate disabilities under human rights legislation generally, whether you're provincially or federally regulated. But sometimes it's not clear for employers what is and what is not a disability. And so with that, I'll warn you, disability is very, very broadly defined. Section 10 of the Ontario Human Rights Code defines disability as any degree of physical disability, infirmity, malformation, or disfigurement that is caused by bodily injury, birth defect, or illness, and then goes on to give some examples. A condition of mental impairment, or a developmental disability, a learning disability, a mental disorder, or an injury or disability for which WSIB benefits have been claimed or received. And that's one that it's often surprisingly forgotten, because it doesn't say approved. It says claimed or received, okay? So it also includes perceived disability. This would apply where a person does not currently have a disability, but they're treated adversely because of a perception that they do have a disability, or that they will develop a disability, and that they will become a burden or pose a risk or require accommodation. So we take a preemptive approach, and we not intentionally end up discriminating against someone because of a perceived disability. So as you're going through the process, you have to keep in mind that there are two components to the duty to accommodate. And people often understand the substantive component because that's ultimately what we're supposed to do. But the procedural component is equally important. So the substantive component requires appropriate accommodations to ultimately be implemented. Of course, this is without undue hardship. I will later cover what undue hardship means and how difficult it is to get there. But the substantive component is, what do we ultimately do? What we do to accommodate that person. The procedural duty is the most complicated one, because that's often where employers may end up failing in the procedural duty to accommodate, because it requires employers to take the appropriate steps to assess the individual employee's needs and to assess how they can be accommodated. It's important to understand, too, that even where there is ultimately no appropriate accommodation that the employer could have implemented without undue hardship, you may get an adjudicator that agrees with you on that. The employer can still be found liable if they did not follow the proper process, if they did not follow the procedural duty to accommodate, if they didn't take the reasonable steps to assess the employee's needs and consider whether accommodation was possible. It is very important that as you're going through this process of considering the employee's needs and considering the different options for accommodation, that you actually document the process. You document the analysis that you've done to assess what positions the employee can perform within their restrictions and limitations and within their qualifications. It is important that you document all of the offers that you've made to your employees with respect to accommodated work. And so we need to engage in discussions. We can't turn a blind eye, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And we need to assess the different options and consider the employee's proposals. Now, also keep in mind that in a process of assessing accommodation, we need the help from medical doctors or medical professionals to provide us with restrictions and limitations. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't get restrictions and limitations, and instead we get the accommodation that the medical professional thinks that should be implemented. That is not the role of the medical professional. The role of the professional is to assess restrictions and limitations, to disclose disability-related needs, and it's not up to the employee either to decide what accommodation they want. They are not entitled to their preferred accommodation. They're entitled to reasonable accommodation as assessed by the employer. Of course, when there's a union, We are dealing with a three-way process. When there's only an employer and employee, we're dealing with a two-way process. So how do we know that we need to accommodate? How is the duty to accommodate triggered? The duty to accommodate can arise not just when the employee asks for specific accommodation. I get a lot of clients that say, well, they didn't make a formal request for accommodation, but they told me that this is related to, their disability, their family status. And so in those cases, we don't need anything more formal than the employee telling us that. We need to now engage in the accommodation process and in that procedural duty to accommodate. And also when an employer suspects that an employee, that their ability to work is affected by a disability, we also can't turn a blind eye. Because there's still some stigma surrounding mental illness and substance use disorders, this can be a very uncomfortable situation when we say to employers, you have a duty to inquire, because they say, well, where do I draw the line, right? This is a delicate topic to raise with the employee, but it's a topic that if it's raised properly, and we're going back to those questions as to what is your organization doing, and your organization is openly talking about mental health and going from a deficit perspective to a universal vulnerability, then that conversation becomes a little easier. So we have to proactively reduce that stigma associated with mental health. And that's when we want to include things like mental health training and discussions, open discussions in the workplace, and resources for our employees as well. So when is that duty to inquire triggered? There is a threshold requirement, and that has to be that the employee or the candidate, because remember, accommodation applies in all stages of the employment relationship, including when we're dealing with a candidate for a position, even if we haven't offered them the position yet. So the employee or the candidate has a disability, and there are reasonable grounds to believe that the employee or the candidate suffers or could suffer some adverse effects or some adverse treatment as a result of either work requirements or policies or employer actions or inactions, and the disability will or could play a role in that adverse treatment. And so in those cases, the employer ought to have known that accommodation is or may be requested. And sometimes we don't know that the employee has a disability, but we suspect that their behavior is unusual based on what we know about this employee. And that's when we get into harder situations with remote workplaces. But I'll give you an example, for instance. If I'm your employee and I have been working for you for 3 years and I've always had good attendance, I've always had good performance, and now through the grapevine you have heard that I'm going through a difficult divorce, and now I'm missing every Monday and every Friday of every week, and perhaps I'm coming into work disheveled, and I'm coming into work smelling of alcohol, or making comments that I miss my alarm clock. In those situations, there should be something triggered in your mind to think, this is atypical for Melissa to do. So let's have a conversation with Melissa. Let's see if everything is okay, right? Because we have some information that would likely cause an adjudicator to say that the duty to accommodate has been triggered. Now, in those situations, it's a lot harder with remote workplaces. There's a lot more opportunity to hide behavioral issues. There's a lot more opportunity to hide mental health issues. Since we're not together in real life, we're not sharing an office, we're not interacting in the proper or traditional way, and we're not seeing people in person struggling. Maybe if I was working remotely, you wouldn't know, because you wouldn't know through the grapevine that I'm going through a divorce, and you wouldn't know that I'm disheveled or smelling of alcohol, because you don't see me if I don't have a meeting with you, right? And that's why it's also important, which again we'll talk about, to keep engaged with your remote workforce. Now, some would also argue that that those things are more self-evident when we're working remotely, because they seem to be more exaggerated sometimes in virtual interactions. Some people appear to have a different level of ease at being rude remotely or over email or over Zoom meetings. It surprises me. And that can either exacerbate other people's conditions, right? If we're dealing with people with disabilities and we're engaging in that kind of less considerate behavior because we're sheltered by this screen, or it can make it hard to identify mental health issues versus standard behavior, right? Is this person acting that way because really they've lost touch for what it is to have an interaction with people because they worked alone for the last 2 years, or are they experiencing mental health issues? So I understand that the current situation poses more problems and challenges for the employer. Another issue is that sometimes visible disabilities may not be seen when people are working remotely. You may have no idea that you just hired someone who was in a wheelchair because you've interviewed them over Zoom, and and as long as their job doesn't require them to engage in certain activities, you may not know it. But we can't make any assumptions. So this is why communication is so key. Now, of course, Melissa Snyder-Adler would be much better to talk to you about any kind of warning signs of mental health, but think about these factors that are in your slide. When it's not known that these things are related to a disability, they can be treated in a disciplinary way, right? But we still have to remain connected to our employees who are not in the office or with whom our schedules do not coincide, so we can identify these potential warning signs and deal with them. So a few takeaways with respect to your duty to inquire. At the end of the day, we have to not make assumptions. We have to make sure that the invisible or visible disabilities are dealt with properly, and that when we're dealing with our employees, if there's something unusual, we have a discussion with them as humans. It doesn't mean that we're going to go into disciplinary or accommodation route. It may just be the start of an inquiry, right? So when considering what accommodations can be implemented, if any, we always start with the employee's own position. If we're a large enough organization, well, we're always going to start with the employee's own position. Then we're going to go to other positions that the employee may be qualified for, that may be vacant, and that are within the restrictions and limitations. And then if we're dealing with employers that are large enough, we may have to go outside of the employee's department, or outside of the employees, in the case of municipalities, outside of the employees, more traditional work setting. And we have to really expand that analysis in order to be able to say, I have engaged in the duty to accommodate. We have to always look at vacant positions. We do not need to displace someone to accommodate somebody else. So we have to look at the essential duties of those positions and whether the employee can perform those duties. Accommodation is not about lowering standards. It is about implementing modifications that allow the employee to perform the essential duties of their position or another vacant position that the employee is qualified to perform. Now, we have to also think about whether there are any defenses or any ability to say there are certain positions that I can't accommodate you on because of bona fide occupational requirements. A bona fide occupational requirement is a standard, a rule, or a factor that is essential to performing the duties of a particular position. So for instance, a bona fide occupational requirement for a construction worker may be to be able to lift a certain amount of weight, right? And we can't accommodate someone who is unable to lift that certain weight. Also remember that while sometimes the accommodation provided to an employee may include absence from the workplace, the human rights protections that the employee is entitled to continue even after they return to work, whether that return to work is with or without accommodations, and whether that return to work is in the same position or in a different position. Sometimes, and I would argue all the time, we might need a ramp-up period after some extended period of absence when somebody reintegrates to the workplace after, for instance, a lengthy mental health leave. Even if they're not officially on restrictions and limitations, ask yourself whether it's right to expect that they jump right back into the swing of things. even if their doctor or their therapist didn't give you a little piece of paper that says that they're going to have certain restrictions and limitations. As a human being, we know that for people it was hard to go back to the office after COVID. So imagine if you have been off for 6 months with major depression. Other things that you have to consider is, a simple orientation, job shadowing, reducing those ancillary duties that you may be able to introduce later without making it permanent. So if you're going to engage in things that are not necessarily required from a human rights code perspective, but that are required to maintain a healthy working relationship, then we want to make sure that we are documenting that and that we're not making it sound like this is a permanent accommodation that will remain later. Honestly, the search for an accommodation is more of an art than a science. However, just like in science, you have to document every step of your process. And that, if you can leave with any message today, make sure that you're documenting everything. So we know that we have to accommodate, but employers often struggle with the concept of undue hardship. Don't assume that you have reached undue hardship. It is very difficult to make out. Often because usually there are a lot of available options if we actually think outside the box. The employer's obligation to accommodate an employee with a disability extends to the point short of undue hardship. And if we're going to try to argue that we've gotten there, first of all, we need to actually be sure that we're dealing with a disability that requires accommodation. And if we have passed that hurdle, then you're going to have to be prepared to disclose a lot of information. You're going to have to disclose information with respect to your financials. And the larger the employer is, the harder it will be to prove undue hardship. And I talk about financials because that's usually what employers say the most. Well, but this is going to cost me money. And it is expected that accommodating an employee will cost you money. Several years ago, the stats were that a standard accommodation costs at least $1,000. I haven't found updated stats on that. I think it's probably higher. But cost is not a defense on its own. The test of undue hardship also is not whether it is impossible to accommodate the employee. That's not the test. The duty to accommodate doesn't include altering working conditions in any kind of fundamental way. The employee has to still be able to perform the basic job duties with accommodation, and those duties have to be the essential duties that they're able to perform. If the employer has satisfied themselves of the employee's inability to perform those essential duties, despite accommodation short of undue hardship, then it has reached its obligation to accommodate, and it has discharged its obligation to accommodate. However, you have to have objective evidence and a reasoned balancing of the employee's interests and those of the workplace parties, which is the employer, and when there's a union, a union. Again, I will stress this, that this is why it's so important to document every step. So we know that undue hardship is a very high threshold, and it's a lot more than business inconvenience. The Ontario Human Rights Policy and Guidelines says that business inconvenience is not a defense to the duty to accommodate. While costs may lead to undue hardship, they have to be quantifiable, they have to be shown to be related to the accommodation, and they have to be so substantial that they would alter the essential nature of the enterprise, or so significant that they would substantially affect its viability. And that's a hard threshold to reach, right? And the larger the employer is, the harder it will be to make that argument. From the case law where employers have tried to claim undue hardship, we have gathered quite a bit of information. And one of the biggest failures is usually having no evidence put forward to quantify the cost or to substantiate the significance of those costs. And it simply cannot be based on opinion evidence of the employer. And there is a court decision, ADGA, Group Consultants and Lane, I can give you the citation later if you want, that has a really good description of undue hardship, or I can give it to you now. It's 2008, Canley, 39605. So it's not a new case, but it has a great description. Undue hardship cannot be established by relying on impressionistic or anecdotal evidence or after-the-fact justifications. Anticipated hardships caused by the proposed accommodation should not be sustained if based only on speculation or unsubstantiated concerns that some adverse consequences might or could follow if the claimant's accommodation is actually granted. We need to prove a significant burden on the employer's operation in order to prove undue hardship. Safety risk to the employee, to co-workers, or to third parties has to be very substantial. And especially when it's a safety risk to the person who is seeking accommodation, and once again, it is the employer's opinion that it is unsafe for that person to perform the job as the doctor has, said that they can, for instance. It has to really be substantial. And adjudicators do not like taking a paternalistic approach. If the employee says that they can do it and their doctor says that you can do it, employer cannot say that they can't. So this is going to include an analysis of both the magnitude of the safety risk and the identity of those who are going to bear the risk, with less weight being given to the own person that is requesting accommodation. Accommodation may require changes to the physical workplace or to work processes. And some of the limits on the reasonableness of these changes will depend on the size of the workforce, the interchangeability of the workers, and the sensitivity of the operations, and so on. A substantial departure from the normal operation of a collective agreement, for those of you who are unionized, may be an undue hardship, but it has to be a substantial departure. And it has to affect the rights of the parties to the agreement. However, every collective agreement and every workplace is unique, and adjudicators may come to opposite conclusions on disability accommodation requests under similar collective agreements because it's all dependent on the language. And while there's no expectation to displace someone, whether it is a unionized or a non-unionized environment, adjudicators have said that sometimes the union has to allow for bending the strict adherence to the collective agreement, for instance, when it comes to seniority rules and accommodating someone. So employers may assess the impact that accommodations have on others in the workplace, but again, we need more than minor inconvenience to other employees to justify undue hardship, because there is an idea that employers have to train their workforce with respect to human rights and with respect to the need for accommodation. So we can't say that just because somebody else is going to ask me for this, I can't do it, right? That's not the kind of argument that works. Accommodation may also involve granting episodic leaves, so leaves that are short in duration, which tend to be very hard on employers because they're very hard to manage. But you have to ask whether a more flexible approach to the traditional work model is better than a strict accommodation, right? So courts have found where an employee is absent from work on disability-related leave that the duty to accommodate requires maintaining the employment relationship unless doing so will be undue hardship. And once again, it's going to be very difficult to prove. If the employer can show that despite reasonable attempts at accommodation, the employee will be unable to resume the duties within a reasonably foreseeable future, then the employer has discharged its duty to accommodate and will probably at some point be able to claim frustration of employment. So some takeaways with respect to the changing workplaces that we have. I read an article from the US about how the post-pandemic world will affect the disabled workforce. And the stats from the US Department of Labor show that since the pandemic, the percentage of disabled individuals who have entered the workforce has actually significantly increased. And this is, for instance, related to the lack of commute. So the author in this article that I read describes that he himself has cerebral palsy, and he could not drive. So the ability to find a job was very limited by transportation logistics. However, with remote work, his opportunities increased significantly, right? Also consider this pre-pandemic, we may have faced situation situation where someone's restrictions and limitations prevented them from driving temporarily, or instead of requesting an accommodation, they tried to make a request for a shift change to enable a family member to pick them up, right? All of these things that we didn't know what they might be related to may either need to be accommodated now, or we may shift the thinking, because telework eliminates the commute, right? It eliminates any potential hazards that individuals might face with driving or with public transportation, or with parking or other architectural barriers in the office. We now create an additional level of protection for individuals with disabilities, that their disability affects their ability to attend the workplace. Many workplaces used to say that regular attendance at work was part of the essential duties of every position, or the bare requirement for performing a job successfully. Once again, that's being challenged now. Some employers try to continue to say that. However, you know, the fact that someone has been accommodated through the pandemic, or not accommodated through the pandemic, but has actually been able to perform their job remotely, will really hinder your ability to now say, no, you must return to work because everybody else is returning to work. You might be able to make some arguments when the circumstances have changed, right? So granting an accommodation, even if it's temporary, may become evidence of a reasonable accommodation in the future. So when you're granting a temporary accommodation, if it is restricted by time because you think that it will affect the performance of the role, then you have to document that when you make that offer. Ultimately, remote work is a good financial investment for companies. Research has found that working from home has reduced meeting times and costs and all of the things that you know that are associated with being in the office. So when we have the potential to save so much in overhead work and the realities of an ability to work remotely, we have to really consider that. There's also some benefits and some negative consequences with respect to telework. Some surveys have indicated that those who work remotely found more time for self-care, whereas this is contrasted with those who say, I can't turn off, I'm always working, right? So the reason I'm pointing this out is because each person's situation will be unique. And if that situation involves any disability-related needs, we have to really look at those. So the flexibility is there. The other thing that we have to consider is whether your policies look in any way like zero tolerance policies with respect to substance use, substance abuse, with respect to certain medications that may need to be taken in the workplace. Human rights legislation requires flexibility when an employee has disability-related needs. And also you need to consider remote workers who have been working remotely, for instance, and now start a hybrid model of coming to the office, and they request accommodation, let's say, for medicinal cannabis use. We immediately think about fitness for duty, but it turns out that they were using this medicinal cannabis for the last 2 years as they work successfully from their home. So you didn't know it because they were working remotely, and all of that is, again, going to factor into your accommodation analysis. One of the potential benefits of telework for individuals who take medication is that it may allow them to structure their day properly, such that they avoid having that unfitness for duty on the other side of taking that medication, as long as you provide them with that flexibility. So instead of denying, let's say you do your whole analysis and you end up getting to a position where you say, no, you cannot take this medication while you're working. Well, if you provide flexibility when they're working remotely, you might be able to skirt around that because that person is likely going to go on leave when you tell them that they can't do it at work, right? The same comments can be made about substance use, and I know that I heard Barb's talk that you already heard that there's people who, for instance, show up to a meeting that are drunk. I actually will tell you I had a situation where the client called me and said, we were in a Teams meeting, and this person who had been working there for a very long time and was an older gentleman just grabbed his glass of wine and had a sip, right? How do you deal with that? Is this a substance use disorder in that case, or is he completely clueless? So again, let's engage in a conversation. Just because you're working from home, it doesn't mean you can drink wine while we have meetings or while you're working, but it has to be one of those situations where you can't turn a blind eye.